Welcome everybody, and welcome to everybody watching online. If I could ask you to make sure your mobile devices are on silent. If you want to tweet from the seminar, could you use the hashtag OMS10? This is part of our 10th anniversary seminar series, so we'll pick up the tweets that way. For those of you watching online, if you do want to ask questions at the end, I'll endeavour to take some from Twitter. Again, please use the hashtag. So this afternoon we're very privileged to have Nick Bostrom. He is one of our original academics. So 10 years ago in 2005, we set up the Future of Humanity Institute, and it was one of our first programmes, and we're very pleased to say that it's a thriving institute, attracting great attention, producing some really remarkable cutting-edge thinking in the areas of existential risk, artificial intelligence, and the future of humanity. So Nick today is going to give an overview of that work, and I'm sure a lot of you will be particularly familiar with his 2014 book, Superintelligence, which has been very widely cited and highly praised across all the continents of the world, and hit the New York Times bestseller list, which for a publication of that type is highly unusual. So I won't give you any further details because most people will know Nick, and that's why you're here. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you. So the topic about what might be and what might have been is actually sort of timely, considering that just yesterday we were celebrating Bassett Day. Does anybody know? I'll give you a clue. So Bassett Day occurs just the day after we celebrate Arkhipov Day. Does that ring any bells? Somebody's heard of it? So Arkhipov was this guy. He was the second in command on a Russian Foxtrot-class submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's one of these close call stories. So at the height of the Cold War, the other people on board his boat, the captain and the political commissar, thought that it was time to fire a nuclear torpedo on an American vessel because they thought that they were under attack. And they were deep below the surface, so they couldn't establish radio contact. And in order to fire, it required the consensus of the top 3 officers. So the captain said, yes, let's fire. The political commissar said, yes, let's fire. And then there was Arkhipov who said, no, let's not fire. So the torpedo was not fired, but it's interesting to speculate what might have happened if, at the height of this tension, a nuclear attack on a US military vessel had occurred, whether that might have escalated into an all-out nuclear war. So Bassett is basically a similar story. In this case, it was a US officer at a secret missile launch site in Okinawa who also prevented some of his colleagues from launching a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. Although the details of this Bassett story only came out in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists a couple of days ago, so it hasn't been as well corroborated. It's not just with these kind of individual decisions at the height of some great geopolitical tension that one can find these counterfactuals that could have swayed history. And another counterfactual we might imagine here is in the process of technological discovery. So you can think of human history as this process of extracting balls from an urn, where these balls represent ideas or insights or technologies. And throughout our tenure here on this planet, we've extracted a great many of these balls, like fire, the wheel, gunpowder. And for the most part, these discoveries have been beneficial. Some of them have been mixed bags. What we haven't yet done is extract the black ball from this urn, some technology that inevitably spells the destruction of the civilization that discovers it. Could such a thing exist? Well, again, we might think back in time, say, 100 years ago or so, when the groundwork, the scientific groundwork, was put in place that eventually led to the development of the atomic bomb. We now know that in order to make a nuclear weapon, you need these difficult to obtain raw materials. You need plutonium or highly enriched uranium, both of which are very difficult to achieve. You need large manufacturing facilities, huge amounts of energy. It's like really only states can do it. But what if it had turned out to be different? What if there had turned out to be some simple way of making nuclear bombs? What if you could have unleashed the power of the atom, say by baking sand in the microwave oven or through some other simple technique? Now we know that that's physically impossible, but before people did the relevant physics, how could we have known how it would turn out? If it had turned out that there were some really easy way to bring the destructive ability to kill millions of people, then quite possibly that might have been the end of civilization, because in any population of millions of people, there will always be somebody who likes to kill the other millions of people, a mad person, somebody who wants to blackmail others, somebody with some ideological agenda. And it might just have been impossible in that kind of world thereafter to have, say, cities or population densities. But again, it's not even only with these large-scale changes where there's some big lever, like new technology, the launch of a nuclear weapon, where we can see some kind of sensitive dependence on counterfactuals. So there was this paper in Moral Philosophy. It was published 15 years ago now by James Lenman. And so he has this thought experiment in this paper. He asks us to imagine that in what is now southern Germany, 100 years before the birth of Jesus, that there was a certain bandit, Richard, lost to history, who raided a village and killed all its inhabitants bar one in this thought experiment. The final survivor, a pregnant woman named Angie, he finds hiding in a house about to be burned, but on a whim, he orders that her life should be spared. So this seems like he did a lot of morally wrong things, but at least this particular decision to spare her life, that was morally fine and the right thing to do. But, Lenman continues, perhaps by consequentialist standards, he should not have done so. Consequentialist standards meaning judging by the consequences of his actions. For let us suppose that Angie was the great, some more greats, grandmother of Adolf Hitler. And thus, the millions of Hitler's victims were also victims of Richard's sparing of Angie. If this bandit Richard had not spared Angie, then she wouldn't have given birth to this ancestor of Hitler, and the whole genetic composition would have been different of all the descendants from that point. And in particular, Adolf Hitler would not have been born, and maybe then there would not have been a Second World War, or maybe there wouldn't. Probably there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. And history might look quite different. So here, even like a seemingly incontrovertibly, morally correct judgment led to these far-reaching ramifications. And you could imagine other things as well. Maybe the fact that the mosquito bit Angie caused her not to have gone outside that day because it took her 30 minutes longer to get ready because she was scratching the mosquito bite. And again, you would find these knock-on effects. The world system is, in a certain sense and to a certain degree, chaotic. It's this butterfly flapping its wings. We can also see that in human affairs. And the most obvious way to illustrate it is the genetic lottery, where it's kind of easy to see that the exact individuals who would be born in a different generation would just be different if you change the initial conditions even slightly. So how to approach this if one is interested in actually acting so as to have good long-term consequences? Well, one might try to improve our ability to foresee the future, improve our forecasting methodology. And indeed, some modest advances have been made. Recently, there's this work by the political scientist Philip Tatlock. He was funded by IARPA to, among some other groups, to test out different ways of generating predictions, in this case about sort of geopolitical developments, like whether there will be whether Assad will still be in power 6 months from now, whether there will be a currency devaluation in China by a certain time, that kind of question. And through a variety of techniques, Tetlock found that it was possible to improve the performance quite significantly compared to either just asking randomly selected people what they feel, or asking indeed expert predictors and indeed people with security clearances and intelligence analysts. It was possible to do quite better. And you can see here the kinds of things that helped with this, like selecting the right kind of people initially to participate, and like doing some pretest to see who was more accurate, and then listening to those people's predictions rather than ones that we have no track record of accuracy for, allowing them to interact in a certain way, doing some cognitive debiasing exercises, and then some statistical techniques on top of that. You can get something that in these settings where 50% or more superior to the status quo when you didn't do these exercises. And this was then, so he found these super forecasters, like individuals who are actually unusually good at this, and he could then test them on a different set of questions to verify that they actually were substantially better. And it's not always the kind of people that one might imagine. It's certainly not like the famous pundits or the people with the most degrees. Some of these were smart people, often with some kind of math or computer science background, but not outstanding in any way. They were not known. They didn't work, for the most part, for like high-status institutions. They were just out there and had time on their hand, and they turned out to be good at this. So it's certainly possible to kind of eke out some improvements in our ability to forecast. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't do that. There are a lot of decisions that society makes that hinge on how likely we are to see various consequences. If you raise the minimum wage or lower the minimum wage, like how likely is that actually to affect the unemployment rate, let's say. And so this defines a new state of the art that I mean, I think should be used when there are a lot at stake. However, it's clear that this kind of progress will not help solve the problem of Angie in the Swiss Valley. Like, that's just not going to fall within the remit of what is predictable. So one needs some different kind of approach if one wants to apply this consequentialist normative standard in this big picture, where we really care about not just the immediate and local effects of our actions, but about all the consequences of our actions. One kind of concept that might be useful in this setting, maybe help us begin to make some progress in how to think about these things, is the concept of an existential risk, defined as one that threatens to either cause the extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life, or to permanently and drastically lock us into some radically suboptimal state. The reason why this might help is that in most cases, it's very difficult to predict what the long-term consequences of your actions will be. Like, maybe it will affect which people are born in the next generation, which will affect whether there is a new Hitler, like some generations down the road. But one kind of effect whose long-term consequences seem relatively easy to predict is the effect of extinction. Like, once we are extinct, we probably will remain extinct for a very long time. That has a kind of predictable, very long-term effect. So it's different from most other ways in which you could imagine manipulating the human condition in one way or another. There is then no future in which these effects kind of might balance out. And so particularly if we have a picture that looks like the one I represent in this schematic, which is, I think, what our actual situation might be. We think of the human condition here as some narrow band where on the one axis there, on the y-axis, we have some measure of capacity, say level of technological development, broadly construed, and on the other hand, we have time. And so what we think of as the human condition occurs within some technological parameters, like we have more technological capability, let's say, than chimpanzees and better brains to think with, but we don't yet have the kind of capability that would enable us to colonize the galaxy. Let's say, or do various other things that do seem, in principle, possible with mature technology. We just don't have that yet. But if we did have that technology, And the other kinds of technologies that one might expect at that level of advancement, the technologies to radically change human nature, to eliminate aging, upload into computers, artificial superintelligence, and so on and so forth, then we might exit what we would think of as the human condition. We have some different condition, the post-human condition. And what this diagram suggests is that just as there is an attractor state in the downwards direction here, we could break out of the human condition. If you have too little productive capability, you can't have a minimum viable population size and you go extinct. And that's an attractor state. You stay there indefinitely. Just as there is one in the downwards direction, there might be one in the upwards direction. That is, once a civilization has reached technological maturity and initiated a process of cosmic colonization, it might then go on for a very long time, billions of years perhaps, until it's filled out all the available room. Both because it's harder for anything to destroy a civilization that is multiplanetary, but perhaps even more importantly, because at that point, it would already have made it through all the possibly very perilous technological transitions that still lie ahead of us. So there might just be fewer remaining like hazards left for it to encounter. So particularly if this is the picture, the concept of an existential risk basically says that anything that can sort of cause us to exit this human condition might have fairly predictable long-term consequences, and a lot will then hinge on whether the exit direction is upwards or downwards. So this leads me to introduce a different kind of idea that's related but slightly different. So it's not, so we might say with regard to Angie example that yes, we can't predict the long-term consequences, but they kind of wash out. So if we assign an equally, so there is some immediate effect, say, of this bandit's decision to save Angie. Like, he can predict with high reliability that that means that she will live for another period of time, maybe enjoy her life for more years. And what he can't predict is how this will affect many generations down the road. But those effects could be either positive or negative, and if there's really no reason to think one way or the other, that those longer term effects will kind of cancel out in expected utility terms. And that what remains in the equation are these more predictable short-term effects, so that he should save her life because there is a clear short-term benefit and the long-term consequences are unknown. So that, I mean, one can discuss to what extent that is sufficient to take away this feeling one might have about consequentialism, that it's kind of beyond the human ken to really engage with that type of reasoning. But at least it's a kind of plausible start. With the crucial consideration, it looks though that we have an additional problem. It's not just that the exact sign of the long-term consequences is uncertain, but things are uncertain in a more radical sense. So let me try to define what I mean by this. So one way to couch it would be that the crucial consideration is one such that if it were taken into account, it would overturn conclusions we would otherwise reach about how we should direct our efforts. So with this bandit saving Angie's life, it's not as if he had stopped to think about it harder or collected some more evidence that would likely change the conclusion that he should save her life. Like that is very likely to remain the correct conclusion, even if he gathered more and more evidence. And really only if he became sort of godlike in its intellect would he maybe be able to see so far ahead that that kind of consideration might change his opinion. But is it possible that there could be crucial considerations relevant to us? Like things that we might not know, but that we could realistically find out that would have the potential to radically change our views about how we should direct our efforts. So a different gloss on this, the same idea. One might say crucial consideration is one that might plausibly reveal the need just for some, not just for some minor course adjustment in our practical endeavors, but a major change of direction or priority. Or you might try to explicate it as a consideration that radically changes the expected value of pursuing some high-level subgoal. So let me try to illustrate what this is by zooming in on a narrow domain. So what I'm really interested in is in sort of crucial considerations relating to the future of humanity. Like if you want to do the morally best action or the action with the best long-term consequences, what should you do? But to illustrate this concept, let us zoom in a little bit first. Well, actually, before we zoom in, let me just put on the table also some related concepts. So you could consider, in addition to the crucial consideration that actually has this effect of radically changing a view, a crucial consideration component, like something that maybe on its own is not enough to really tell you what to do, but it's the kind of insight that might plausibly, when combined with some other insights, have that effect. And deliberation ladders. So let's see what a deliberation ladder is. It's a sequence of crucial considerations, such as illustrated by this example. So question, should I vote in the national election? So a simple consideration might be, well, I should vote in order to put into office the better candidate. That seems to be a good reason for voting in the national election. So a crucial consideration in this case might be something like, well, actually my vote is extremely unlikely to make a difference. I should not vote, but put my time to better use. So first you think, well, I should put the best candidate into office, but then you realize that the chance is, less than 1 in a million that I will actually do that. So the value of the action is actually quite a lot lower than one might naively think. But there are further crucial considerations. You might say that although it is unlikely that my vote would make a difference, the stakes are high, and millions of lives are affected by what the government does or the president does. So even if the chance of my vote being decisive is only 1 in several millions, the expected benefit is large enough to be worth the trip to the polling station. If the outcome is something that affects millions of lives, and if you have this sort of utilitarian perspective where the effects on each individual life are added up, then that would tend to counterbalance the small probability that you would actually have an influence. So at this point in the crucial consideration ladder, it looks like you should vote, you should go to the polling station. But the ladder doesn't stop there. You might further reason that if the election is not close, then my vote will make no difference. But if the election is close, then approximately half the votes will be for the wrong candidate, implying that either the candidates are almost of exactly equal merit and it doesn't really matter who wins, or that the typical voter's judgment of the candidate's merits is extremely unreliable and carries almost no signal. It's just noise, randomness. So I should not bother to vote. This is an additional modulating effect that you should take into account, right? The possibility that you will actually be voting for the wrong guy. But we can take a step further. You might think that I'm a much better judge of the candidate's merits than the typical voter. So even though the previous level of the wrong here suggests shouldn't bother, well, actually, maybe you should bother because you are not a typical voter. However, psychological studies show that people tend to be overconfident. Almost everybody believes themselves to be above average, but they are as likely to be wrong about this as to be right about it. So if I'm as likely to vote for the wrong candidate as is the typical voter, then my vote would add negligible information to the selection process, and I should not bother to vote. So notice here that it's not just that we have at each rung of the ladder some additional reason for or against. Like these are such that, at least taken at face value, they sort of purport to radically change your conclusion, like from you should vote to the exact opposite, you should not vote. We can take further steps, actually. The fact that I have gone through the previous 6 steps demonstrates that I am exceptionally savvy. I am therefore more likely to pick the best candidate, and I should vote. So now we finally reached the correct conclusion then, and we can stop there and be confident that we are actually improving the world with our effort. But if I'm really so special, then the opportunity cost of my going to the polling booth is especially high. I should not vote, but instead use my rare abilities to some higher value activity. If I don't vote, my acquaintances will see that I have failed to support the candidate both they and I think is best. This would make me look weird and disloyal, diminishing my influence, which I could otherwise have used for good ends. So I should vote, not because my vote itself makes any difference, but because it signals to the community that I'm kind of, a sensible guy who goes along and does his bit. However, it's important to stand up for one's convictions. It stimulates fruitful discussion. Moreover, when I explain the intricate reasoning that led me to refrain from voting, my friends will think I'm clever, and that would increase my influence, and so I should not vote. And there's no particular reason to think that the ladder stops there. Like, it might be the last consideration we have thought of, but if we spend another month thinking really hard about this, perhaps we could add another rung. And so it's a little disconcerting if if there might be one or more of these rungs there, like they could point in whichever direction. So it looks like we really have no reason whatever to think that our decision, in this case, voting, is more likely to be right than that the opposite decision would have been. If we had run out of ideas here, then we would have reached the opposite. So there is this sequence of crucial considerations that seem to vitiate any attempt to like rationally pursue these long-term consequences. So let's look at another example just to bring it a little bit closer to technology strategy. So and existential risks. So suppose we ask whether I should favor more funding for research into technology X. The structure of the argument here doesn't really depend much on what X is. You might imagine it's like molecular nanotechnology or some advanced form of synthetic biology or something like that. So you might think we should fund X technology research because there are many potential future applications in medicines, in manufacturing, clean energy, etc. Actually, this seems to be the level of deliberation at which most people sort of stop at all. Like this is, when academics make the case for funding in the public domain, this is the level of sophistication, basically. You know, a lot of good stuff could come out of this. But let us say that for this kind of technology, it would also have important military applications, and it might ultimately make it possible to produce new kinds of weapons of mass destruction that would pose major existential risks, so we should not fund it. I mean, this is, you know, with some things in biotechnology or nanotech or maybe AI, it's not such a ridiculous idea. If we really harken back to this earlier idea of using a concept of existential risk as a focusing lens, then maybe anything that could have that kind of effect will just tend to trump any sort of short-term benefits in medicine. But we might reason that if this kind of X technology is really possible, it will almost certainly be developed sooner or later, even if we decide not to pursue it. If responsible people refrain from developing it, it would be developed by irresponsible people, which would make the risk even greater. So we should fund the research. And you know, that's like it's a good point, like as far as it goes. Like we should take into account these kinds of things. But we can continue. Let's say that for this technology, we are already ahead in its development. Maybe we here might mean Oxford, it might mean Britain, or it might mean the sort of the democratic, you know, industrialized world. And we are worried whether we should like leave the development of this to North Korea or whether like the democratic advanced countries should move ahead. But at the moment, we are obviously far ahead in this kind of technology. So extra funding would really only serve to make us reach this technology sooner, leaving us with less time to prepare properly for its dangers. So we should not add funding. Like we should just keep one step ahead of North Korea, or whoever we're worrying will get it first. And we can probably slow down quite a lot and still make sure that we do that. But look around, we see virtually no efforts, no serious efforts to prepare for the dangers of X technology. And this is because serious preparation will only begin after a massive project is already underway to develop this technology. Only then will people take the prospect seriously. So the earlier this massive effort to develop this technology starts, the longer it will take to complete, because it will then start from a lower baseline level of technology. And so launching a serious product now, therefore, means more time for serious preparation, which will reduce existential risks. And so we should push ahead as hard as we can. So actually, this argument is not hypothetical. Like this has actually been put forward with regard to nanotechnology by Eric Drexler back in the late 80s. If you just replace X technology with molecular nanotechnology, he was kind of going through this when thinking about whether or not he should sort of promote this. But we can continue even further. The level of risk will be affected by other factors than the amount of serious preparation that has been made specifically to counter the threat of nanotechnology or artificial intelligence. For instance, machine intelligence or ubiquitous surveillance might be developed before X technology, eliminating or mitigating the risks of X technology. So like having some simple way of concocting like a doomsday germ using synthetic biology might be different in the present world from a future world where maybe we have ubiquitous surveillance or some other thing has changed. So although these other technologies may themselves pose existential risks, those risks would have to be faced anyway because X technology would not help reduce them. So the preferred sequence is that, along this argument would be that we get superintelligence or ubiquitous surveillance, let us say, before we get X technology. So we should oppose extra funding for this technology. However, if we oppose extra funding for X technology, the people working in this field will dislike us. And other scientists might regard us as being anti-science. And this will reduce our ability to work with these scientists, hampering our efforts on more specific issues that stand a much better chance of making a material difference than any attempt on our part to influence the national level of funding for X technology. So we should not oppose extra funding for X technology. And again, there's no reason to think that we've reached the limit here. So these are kinds of considerations that we actually are wrestling with when we are like, it seems kind of bizarre, but these, once you start to actually try seriously to answer this question or even form a view about this question of whether the long-term consequences are likely to be positive or negative, there is no way, it seems, that one can avoid engaging with these kinds of questions, which is disturbing. So one might, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there does seem to be some difference here. So these crucial considerations and crucial consideration ladders that I described were defined relative to this normative idea of actually performing the action with the best expected long-term consequences, like a utilitarian outlook where you weigh up the well-being of all of individuals or the value of all parts of the world, and it doesn't matter fundamentally from a moral point of view whether that part is located now or 20 years from now or 20 million years from now. Like if there is suffering in that part, it counts equally, just as maybe it counts equally if you move it around in space. Like a person's suffering is equally morally bad whether it occurs here or in Leeds or in Africa. Right? However, most of our decision making occurs in other contexts, so maybe in everyday life, like we have a lot of experience making decisions all the time, and it doesn't seem like we are typically paralyzed with these kinds of considerations. Like there does seem to be some difference between this kind of utilitarian norm and, say, the norm that you're pursuing in your ordinary life, which might be something more like, like have as much fun as possible while being a decent spouse and a good parent and also like a good colleague. Like maybe there are more components there, but some sort of typical human goal that is not driven by some strange ideology or moral theory. There we don't seem to encounter these kinds of crucial considerations, or at least more rarely. I mean, maybe once in their life somebody will have like a religious awakening or something like that that could radically change their mind about their overall scheme of priorities. But many people don't, and even the people who do, it's not as if they spend most of their lives typically engaging in this very complicated analytical reasoning about the overall structure of their goals. So some possible reasons why there might be this difference between the utilitarian and the sort of typical human stance on this is that, well, we have a lot more knowledge, perhaps, of running individual lives. I mean, there have been billions of people trying this before. We have a lot of data to learn from. Whereas when it comes to sort of guiding the development of artificial intelligence or synthetic biology, we don't, it's not as if we have a billion trajectories of other civilizations that have tried different things that we can just learn on. We really have to sort of try to think about it from first principles. So that could be a reason why there is this difference. There might be differences in how easy it is to understand the goal itself, like we have an intuitive understanding of what we want as individual human beings, but this utilitarian goal there's some technical issues there. One possibility is kind of what I alluded to earlier, that maybe the utilitarian is particularly likely to confront these crucial considerations if he or she lives at this special point in human history. Like if it is actually the case that we are close to this historical pivot point during which the long-term future of Earth-originating intelligent life might be determined. Like if it is the development of superintelligence or some other key thing that might happen in this generation or in this century, or at any rate not like indefinitely far into the future. If we are so close to this pivot point, then maybe what is otherwise just shielded by the fog of unknowability, like in Angie's decision or the bandit's decision to save her life. Like maybe we've kind of moved close enough to the critical point that although we can't clearly see what we should do, we can kind of begin to make out some contours so that suddenly it becomes very relevant to engage cognitively with any little clue we have about what this lever is that might affect world history and how we might best affect it. Finally, also, it might be that we have only recently discovered some of the key exploration tools, some of the concepts and ideas that make it possible really to engage intellectually with these things at all, arguably. So the concept of an existential risk is maybe one of those, and there might be a few others, like the concept of machine superintelligence. For most of human history, these concepts didn't exist. So it might just be that we're only now beginning to actually get the intellectual equipment to start being affected by these crucial considerations. So one might think that this suggests a kind of intellectual project of trying to identify some plausible evaluation function. So let me explain what I mean by an evaluation function. So in chess computing, the way that a chess computer works is not by sort of computing from the outset all the way to the end of the game and then just picking the move that is guaranteed to win, because there are too many moves at each ply, and so you have this combinatorial explosion of possible sequences that could be played, and you can't think it through all the way to the end. So how do we do it instead? Well, instead what you do is you have some heuristic evaluation function that can look at some arbitrary state of the board and then assign some estimate to how good that state is from your point of view. If you're playing white, how promising does this situation look for white? And so a number of components might go into this evaluation. They should be relatively simple to compute in order to be suitable for this purpose. But typically what you might use is something like material, how many pieces do you have? Do you have your queen left? That's worth more than a pawn. That creates one ingredient. Then you might take into account mobility, how developed is your position? Do you have a lot of options ahead that you can count up? Is your king, does it look like it's protected behind a wall of pawns? Center control. So you might add a few of these, and each one of those has some weight depending on how important it is. And then that gives a rough heuristic that will not always exactly say how good the state is, but it will give you some general sense. And so then the idea is to combine this evaluation function with alpha-beta search, which is basically just thinking, if I play this, what is the best way that the opponent could play? And given that he plays that, what is the best response I could do? And then you do that as deep as you can. Maybe 8, 10, 12 plies down until you run out of computing power. And then when you look into this tree as far as you have time to do before your time runs out, then at these leaf nodes, you will then apply this evaluation function to. And then you will pick the action now that even if the opponent does as well as he can, will sort of eventually lead to the highest expected value of this position. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the basic idea. So the evaluation function here is necessary in this kind of algorithm because you need some quick and simple way of evaluating some possible state that you might reach. So one might think by analogy that we use something similar in other spheres, not just in chess playing, but say in public policy. Maybe you have some kind of evaluation function that says that, well, other things equal, probably if we have more economic growth, it's good. If employment is higher, that's good. If there is less inequality, it's good. If the environment is not as destroyed as it would be on this other policy, that tends to weigh in its favor. And there could be other terms here as well, of course, and different people might have different weights and different factors here. But the important thing here is not that we could hope to write it down or that it would even be a useful thing to try to do, but more that we might think we have some intuitive notion, each one of us, if we could see society 5 years down the road, whether we would like that more than some other way that society could be. And it might be influenced by some variables, some of which we could at least mention. And so the question then is, could we find something similar for this utilitarian perspective? And what would that look like? Because that, some kind of, if we can't possibly think through the consequences of our actions all the way down to sort of the end of the world, 100 billion years from now, or however long it might take, then we need to be able to evaluate intermediate states or some effects that we might achieve through our actions that we can reasonably foresee, and then we need to make a guess as to whether that has taken us in the right direction or in the wrong direction. And So one proposal here that I have suggested is this, that this might be approximated by this max epoch rule. I mean, this is a hypothesis. The max epoch rule would say that you should maximize the probability of an okay outcome, where that is any outcome that avoids existential catastrophe. For these reasons indicated earlier. Like, it might be that if all you want to do is to do the thing that does the most expected good in the world, that you should forget about all the other aspects of how your action affects the world, and that you should only think about this question of whether it increases or decreases the integral of existential risk. It's a possibility that this might capture some. I mean, I think that there are some complications, but it certainly seems like, if we do accept that we have taken a step towards answering this question of what you should do, all things considered. Now, it's true, we still face this question of, in order to like follow this max epoch rule, we would have to assign some, we would have to know the probability, conditional on different actions we might take, of achieving an okay outcome, like how our actions actually affect the net level of existential risk. And granted, that might be an extremely difficult thing to know. However, it seems slightly easier to know than, like, say, the bandits' problem of knowing whether sparing Angie's life would have good overall consequences. So we've kind of taken one step to simplifying the problem. If this identification there is correct, then the problem would simplify to, instead of thinking about what has the best overall long-term consequences, just think about what will do the most to reduce existential risk. And you might then try to identify different factors that you think are proxies to the net level of existential risk. Like, perhaps you could argue that the wiser humanity is as a collective, like the better our sort of collective information processing and filtering system and the judgments we bring to bear are, that would tend to reduce existential risk. Like, you could certainly imagine scenarios in which would increase some particular existential risk, but maybe you think on balance that kind of thing is likely to be a kind of robustly X-risk reducing. You might think, I mean, all of these would have to be argued for, but like just as sort of things to consider, you might think that more global coordination would reduce existential risk on balance. Maybe it would increase some existential risk, like the risk that you get permanently locked into some global totalitarian state that uses advanced surveillance technology and genetic breeding to make it like self-immune from overthrow forever. Like, it might increase that risk, but maybe global coordination would still on balance reduce existential risk, because a lot of existential risk seems to result either from war and conflict with new kinds of weapons that might be invented, or in the case of technology races where it's just difficult to coordinate, to agree, say, not to develop a particular technology. If there were one of these black balls, like if you had very good global coordination, perhaps you could all agree to put it back in the earth and never put it out. And maybe something like differential technological development might be another, where you try to sort of accelerate those technologies that tend to protect against existential risks and maybe impede the development of technologies that would increase existential risks. And thinking not just for a new technology, is this good or bad, but exactly when would we ideally want that technology to enter the world. I mean, that's all we're really doing as academics anyway. Like, we are moving the introduction of a new idea from a later time when somebody else would have introduced the idea anyway to a slightly earlier time when we are now introducing it thanks to our work. So that seems like maybe a deflationary account of what we do, but sometimes these exact differences in timing might make a big difference. Like, if it's a cure for malaria that arrives into the world 1 week earlier than it otherwise would, that's a lot of people's lives that are saved. And if it's an X-risk protecting technology that arrives just before the existential risk that it protects against, then indeed, it might be a cosmically important thing to do. So anyway, those are some kind of things that one might begin to gradually break down this overall question. What should I do, all things considered? You try to find ways to simplify this question, to break out parts of the question, and then each of those sub-questions turn out to be really difficult itself, but you keep hammering at them and try to break them down. And so that's kind of, at a very high level altitude, look, the kind of thing that I see frames the work that we are trying to do with the Future of Humanity Institute. And so I'm not gonna, I was gonna say maybe a few words on AI that has been the focus of a lot of our work recently, but I'm short on time. We talked to various kinds of policymakers and tried to have an effect in the world, not just by publishing academic papers, but by getting the ideas to the places where they can make a difference. And also try to do something akin to cell division. So in addition to expanding our group here at Oxford with the support of the OMS, we're also trying to encourage similar efforts elsewhere. So there now exists at Cambridge University the Center for the Study of Existential Risk that we've kind of helped midwife, and also the Future of Life Institute even more recently was created, which even more recently, as in this year, helped engage the interest of Elon Musk, who'd read some of our work and such, got interested in the future of AI, and he's now putting in some funding, which is funding a number of research groups around the world to try to actually lift some of these topics that have traditionally been the remit of science fiction authors or sensationalist tabloids, or like retired physicists to write something in his dotage on the big questions when the person can no longer do like real scientific work. Try to lift these very important questions out of that kind of sideline and put them into the forefront where one can bring to bear some of the the best minds that exist around the world, and try to see if we can make some progress on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was a fantastic overview of the type of thinking that you're involved in. We do have about half an hour for questions. Nick will take them, and I'll give you a wave, Nick, when we're running out of time. And like I said before, if you're watching online and you have a question, do tweet using #OMS10, and I'll stick my hand up for you. Oh, sorry, I should also just say, I've forgotten to say, this is being live webcast and filmed, as you've obviously gathered. If you don't want to be on camera or have your voice on camera, don't ask a question.
Yes, at the back there.
I just want to know if you're hiring.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we happen to be hiring. What a funny coincidence that you should ask that. Andrew is our director of research. Yeah, we are currently advertising for a number of positions. So if you or people you know are interested in these things, do point them our way.
Thank you. I'm Robert Tilliard. I'm from Lincoln College doing economic and social history. I was a little bit reminded of another philosopher who used to be down the road who once said, we are all doomed to choose. And each choice involves irreconcilable loss. I guess what I was wondering was, can you actually imagine a scenario where we would halt technological progress because of your algorithm or because of your modeling? And how would that actually happen?
Well, for the most part, it's not the lever that we imagine that we would be pulling, that for various reasons. So it's not, when we are thinking about other ways we could influence the world, that's not the first thing that comes to mind. Now, I think that if we think more broadly, there's maybe particular cases of specific technologies, like a good example might be biological weapons, where I think progress has slowed down thanks to the Convention Against Biological Weapons, and it has maybe slowed down or prevented so far an arms race in biological weapons. and there are some other blinding laser weapons, lethal chemical weapons. And so it might well be that there are specific narrow slices of technology that it could be feasible to get some international consensus on. But I don't hold out much hope for any, say, general purpose technology, like biotech or nanotech or machine intelligence. Like, it just seems completely unrealistic that you would get any effective ban on those. And it's not clear at all that it would be even desirable to do that, even if you could. So for both of those reasons, it seems like a lost cause to try to do that. But there are a lot of other things. I mean, so just like one very, very close idea, like in addition to, like, you might try to actively prevent some research from going forward. I mean, another thing you could do is just to try to add the marginal talented person or research dollar to the kind of areas which you actually think are most protective or useful. And to get some of this prioritization thinking in there, like you might refrain yourself from actively contributing to a particular field if you think that that field will, on balance, make things worse or increase X risk. But it's not really even that that's the main focus. I mean, there are a lot more other specific things, and these will vary from area to area. So with regard to, say, long-term prospects in artificial intelligence, it looks like there are certain kinds of research on the construction of artificial motivation systems, on the control system and such, that would be useful, that we might need to have carried out before people figure out how to actually make machines really smart. And so there is something where you want to accelerate the research and build up a research field, and we're trying to do this and help stimulate people from neighboring fields to migrate into there, get some of the best math talent to start to think about these things. Other things you might want to do is to build up a community of people who share an understanding of what the problems are. So working closely, say, with leading AI developers, so that if and when in the future at some point these issues do become pressing, that there are good communication channels and people are on the same page. But with other X-risk, there might be very different kinds of approaches that would seem more promising. I think we have a question here in the front.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I'm at St. Catherine's College studying computer science and philosophy. I had a question about the crucial considerations ladders. As you showed, they can go on for quite a while. But you mentioned that you use them sometimes in your work, decision-making at the Institute. So I was wondering, when you're trying to apply them to a practical problem, how do you know, or how do you decide when to stop?
Yeah, so we don't, I mean, it's not that we are, it's more an expression of the predicament that I feel that we are in. It often feels like we are fumbling around in the dark, making progress, but the concern is that until you've found that last piece, that all your progress so far might be as good as nothing. If there is even just one more crucial considerations you have overlooked, even if you've done fantastic work and identified 5 crucial considerations exactly correctly, there's one you overlooked. Maybe your recommendation will actually push the world in further away from where it needs to go. That's the concern. And that's like a live concern. I wish I had the answer to how to deal with that. I mean, other than, trying harder to think through these kind of foundational conceptual issues. So I introduced it more as to explain why. So today I wasn't really talking much about specific technologies and what we might do with regard to AI or synthetic biology. But so why go through this almost more philosophical stuff? Isn't that just the kind of ivory tower idleness that's really interesting, but doesn't really connect into the real world? Well, it does seem that one is forced, unfortunately, to confront these kinds of foundational issues when one is trying to do something in this arena. So just to explain why we have an interest in these things. And I mean, so until we have a better answer, I guess you just have to try to climb up those crucial consideration ladders. And I mean, there are some things that you kind of common sense things, like you want to be less confident at any given level than it looks if you just looked at that level. You want to take into account the possibility that there might be, or might not be, but there could be one or more additional crucial consideration. You might want to see if there are actions you could take that would be robustly positive across a wider range of scenarios, things like building up general purpose resources that can then hopefully turn out to be a useful thing to have done, even if it turns out later that the direction in which you want to employ those general purpose resources is very different than you thought. So that could be applied sort of at the micro level in terms of, just say the Institute, securing funding, bringing in really great people, creating an institutional culture that makes it possible to make progress. These things seem useful across a wide range of scenarios. You might also think of it at the macro level in terms of what human societies could do. When I had this suggested sketch of evaluation function for reducing X-risk, it had some features like wisdom was there. So you might think if global wisdom is one of these things that would tend to be relatively robustly positive across a wide range of scenarios, then maybe the more concerned we are with there being additional crucial considerations, maybe the more we should focus on boosting like global wisdom and the less on pushing specific fixes for specific technologies or pursuing specific scenarios.
Okay, I have a question from Twitter. What specific technologies should we focus on developing, and what is the most dangerous thing we're overlooking?
Well, I mean, we should be doing a lot of different things. With regard to AI, like, I mean, I think the AI safety technology, like giving that a boost, seems like a good thing to do. You might think more generally, if say wisdom is something you want to promote, like other proxies, the wisdom itself is too like intangible. You can't just, I'm going to increase wisdom today. Like you have to sort of break that down into things that A, would be very likely actually to increase wisdom, but also B, would be such that your actions could make a big difference on them. So say educating one like high school student at the time and teaching them to appreciate the great insights that are expressed in world literature and such. I mean, maybe that would be a lot more likely to increase wisdom than decrease wisdom, but it's also something that is going to just have very little impact. But are there these pivot points where like a relatively small intervention could have a disproportionate, maybe if there are things, say, cognitive enhancement technologies for humans, like if there were some easy way in biotechnology that to develop something that could then roll out on that millions could use, that would significantly boost their ability to, say, develop wisdom. And maybe you can't directly have a wisdom trait, but maybe you could make guesses about which other traits correlate with wisdom, like, you know, I don't know what it would be, maybe intelligence, humility, like need for cognition, whatever it is. And then you could see, like, are there ways that you could try to influence the development, say, of genomics to make it more likely that such an application will be developed and deployed. Then you could zoom in even more, like where is the place that this might happen soonest, like, say, in vitro fertilization with embryo screening, you know, that already is happening, and you will be able to screen for more different things. There's independently of this, a big bioethical debate about whether that should be done or not. You could engage with that. Or you could try to see what the bottlenecks are in this particular scientific field. Are there like stakeholders that should talk to one another and don't? Are there funders who want to do something good but haven't yet found that this is a spot in which to engage? Are there big data sets that sit around, like, say, with genomic information on the one hand and socioeconomic outcomes on the other, that if combined could, like, make it possible to make more rapid advance, if that's what you want to do? And so for any one of these, like, they are a big discussion in its own right with, like, a lot of arguments for and against. But these are the kinds of things you might want to look at if you wanted to go down the wisdom route. And you might also take another approach, like do the kind of stuff that Tetlock did. Or you might try to do the kind of stuff that we are doing, like maybe by introducing these general concepts. Like if there is even one or two more concepts like this that help kind of identify and shape the field, maybe one can get a lot of other people interested in it, and maybe that can then indirectly spill over. Or you might try to set up a prediction market somewhere and think that that will reward people for being right rather than telling good stories. And so, but you want to keep in mind at all points when you're doing that thinking, both like how confident are you that the thing you would change would actually positively correlate with the thing you ultimately care about, say X risk, and also like how much leverage do you have over this thing. So both of those variables need to factor in.
Thank you very much. Danny Dorling, studying geography at St. Peter's College. I was interested in your example of Angie, partly because I think it was the only woman you mentioned, but that isn't my question, although I do wonder about whether the future is so affected by men. It was more the idea that Angie was terribly important and that killing Angie would help. You later on said that all scientists do is really invent or do something a little bit earlier than somebody else would have done it. I think it's Auden who said that those to whom evil is done do evil in return. If it hadn't been Hitler, there would have been another corporal who the same kind of things that happened to in the First World War, he would have joined and started a Nazi party. So how does the example of Angie fit with your later example of saying that all that people do is something that somebody else would just have done a few minutes or hours later?
Well, I mean, so the devil is in the details there. So I didn't say a few minutes or hours later. Like if you run a really great research group and work hard and use your creativity and brilliance to make some scientific progress, it might accelerate that subfield by more than minutes or hours. It might accelerate it by months or years. And that might make a big difference. So if we're thinking about the bandits' decision to spare Angie, it's not as if all of world history would just have been exactly the same. There is no guarantee even that it would have balanced out. You know, maybe there would have been a Second World War, or maybe there wouldn't. This is the kind of thing that historians debate when they try to run counterfactuals. It's you know, would have reduced the risk of a Second World War. It would have reduced even more probably the risk of a Holocaust, because that seemed to have depended more on the idiosyncrasies of the Führer than that there were big tensions in Europe that maybe were going to be resolved through armed conflict. And I mean, of course, we haven't seen the last of it either. Like, so who knows what the long-term consequences if we then roll the tape ahead another equal many generations, like, you know, we haven't seen the end of the story. So, so when thinking about technology there's like an intermediate ground, like, so there are the determinists and the indeterminists, but they are like both implausible positions if you interpret them strictly, so in the interesting way. So it's not as if, so I think the right question to ask is, given some change in initial conditions, which might be, if you're asking for an individual, that you make one decision or another, like what does the expected future look like from that point onwards? So you go in, kind of perform counterfactual surgery on the world, and then you end up in a different possible world, and you try to guess what that possible world will look like. And we can be highly confident that certainly some details would be different if one disturbed the initial conditions in any way. Like the precise individuals that would have lived if the bandit had spared Angie would be different. I mean, we know that just from what we know about the human reproductive system and all these different egg and sperm with different genetic dispositions that would result in individuals with different personalities who would then mate with different people. And so everything that depends on human idiosyncrasies, right away you would get that would probably be different. You might then think that there is a larger or smaller scope for human idiosyncrasies to affect world history. Like some people think it's pretty much rolling along its track, and the big patterns are sort of determined from the outset. There's going to be the sequence of new technologies that are developed. There's going to be, once you get to the industrial era, you will get these like armies that used the industrial revolution to build tanks and airplanes, and you're going to have the capitalist economy, and they're going to fight. But even the people who are kind of determinists to that degree of thinking that there is that degree of determinism, if they're sane, would all agree that, well, the micro-level details, like exactly which person did what on which day, like would vary if you changed the initial conditions. And that might or might not make a big difference. But if everything else were fixed, and the only thing it could affect were some small differences, then according to the utilitarian criterion, then that's what should be driving your decision. Yes, there.
I'm Ken Kahn. Regarding the ladder of crucial considerations, if it was sort of a public forum and there was a long history of it, I'm wondering if the fact that it takes longer and longer for somebody to make the next rung of the ladder, that it gives you some confidence that maybe there aren't any more because people have been kind of stuck at the ladder at some level for the last few years. Is that at all plausible, that the history of the development of the ladder gives you some confidence
Sure.
that maybe there's not much more for it to grow?
Yeah, in principle. So it's like you could imagine some question search when you keep searching for new rungs until you don't seem to find any more for a sufficiently long period of time. It's just that for many of the cases that we care about, we don't seem to have reached that. Like it seems almost the opposite, that a lot of the rungs have been added only very recently. And even if you could like have a period of 3 years where nobody had found another, I mean, how much does that really tell us with these kinds of macro strategic? I mean, you really would want a period of maybe 10,000 years or something like that, during which a lot of talented people from a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different cultures and ideologies should have like tried their hardest to find one and failed. That might, and even that, I mean, you might think that it just means we've hit the limit of what the human brain will see, but like cognitively enhanced people might discover something beyond that. So all of these things are matters of degree. Like it's not as if we can know nothing about whether we have reached the final rung. There's some probability that it is, and we can make guesses based on like these inductive arguments. And the longer the period that we have tried really hard without finding one, like the higher the probability will be that it is the last one. But for many of the big ones, I do still think that at this point in time, in like late 2015, that we should assign a significant probability to there being at least one. It only takes one more, right? Whether you have sort of overlooked another 14 or there was just one more, I mean, it's still vitiates your confidence in your conclusion. Maybe just next to you.
Hi, I'm Rafael Pereira. I'm doing a PhD in geography, and I'm from Teddy Hall. And I think almost everybody would agree that consequentialism is helpful in the sense that it helps us make more effective and more efficient decisions. There is quite a wide range of literature discussing the limits of utilitarianism and consequentialism, in the sense that there are more deontological understandings that some things are intrinsically wrong, right or wrong, right? So I would like to to hear from you, how do you think that people working in artificial intelligence and other technologies that are groundbreaking, how are they incorporating other strands of moral political philosophy theories that go beyond utilitarianism and consequentialism? Is there any role for this?
Well, there certainly are other moral theories, and a lot of people who embrace other moral. I mean, so I'm not like a utilitarian myself. Like I have some uncertainty over different moral philosophies, and some probabilities to them. Like I don't. It's misguided to think that you're 100% sure you found the correct moral theory when there are all these other wise people throughout history and at the current time that have thought about it just as hard as you have, and they have different views. And like you should kind of acknowledge there is significant possibility that you're wrong. So then the question becomes, how can you make decisions under fundamental normative uncertainty when you're not even certain about what the criteria for making a decision should be? And so this is an interesting little sub-problem in its own right, that's recently begun to receive some attention in moral philosophy. And so my take on that is that I think it is useful to think in terms of a moral parliament. So like you imagine this, it's like an imaginary parliament, and different moral theories get to send representatives to this moral parliament. How many representatives does each theory get to send? A number proportional to the probability assigned to the theory. So more probable theories get to send more. And then you imagine, you have to hand wave a little bit, but you imagine that these delegates kind of negotiate and bargain in this moral parliament, and then whatever that moral parliament would recommend that you should do that. And so the idea is that some moral theories care a lot about some specific things, but maybe they have some views about other things as well, but they just don't think that's very important. And so you should sort of try to give as many moral theories as possible, as much of what I think is really important as possible, like weighted by the probability. So say the utilitarian might think, no, like presenting X risk is really important. So if you're ever faced with a choice where you would have to say do something that another moral theory is wrong, like telling a white lie or something, but you could reduce X risk by 10%, and maybe the moral parliament would say go with the utilitarian in that situation, and then make it up to the deontologist in other situations where the utilitarian thinks less is at stake. But then not just with deontology and utilitarianism, but more widely. And you might even imagine putting self-interest in there as well, insofar as you're egoistic. You care some about doing the morally right thing, but you also care particularly about having a good life yourself or doing nice things to your family. You could imagine putting all of that in there. Each of those is like a party that gets to send delegates. You decide on the weight depending on how moral you are and how much you care about other things. And then imagine that they all bargain and try to find compromise solutions that give as much as possible to what each party wants. And so you can imagine some, I don't know whether we should, but yeah, so I don't think that this is the exactly correct way of dealing with moral uncertainty, but I think it is perhaps a fairly robust way that is unlikely to like get things catastrophically wrong. So I think it's in particular better than, say, picking your favorite moral theory and then just acting as if you knew that that theory was right. And it's better than some other things as well, but it's a little underspecified exactly how this bargaining situation, like who sets the agenda for this imaginary parliament. It might be that a lot depends on the agenda and the exact conditions of bargaining. So that's kind of just a hand waved over. We have, I think you might be next in.
Hi, I'm Carl. I study at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I was wondering about the role of religion in the 21st century. So it seems we have a lot of difficult choices to make, and a lot of the categories that we consider to be essential, like the category human, seems to be kind of dissolving. And religion is currently growing around the world, and I wonder what you think is going to happen to it in the future.
So I mean, I don't have any special insight on religion as a sociological phenomenon, and we haven't really done any work on that. And just as a sort of everyday observer, I mean, it is striking. I think some people back maybe in the mid-century thought that maybe religion was clearly on the wane with the rise of the scientific literacy, but clearly it has a lot of strength. And but beyond that, I don't really know any more than you do, I think. But it's the kind of thing that if you did want to know, I mean, you could either spend years and years in the library trying to build up some model of this and test it against different, or you could ask some of these of TED super forecasters to say what they think, and you'd get some probability estimate, which would probably be a better probability estimate than one that you or I could come up with. So if you needed a quick answer, which then that might be the best we could do. If we had a prediction market, then maybe we could do even better. I think, yeah.
I just wanted to kind of push a bit on the idea of the parliament and making decisions under normative uncertainty, but even getting to the point, it seems like to me, to the point you were talking about where you could kind of have some framework for making decisions under normative uncertainty. To get there, you have to make a prior decision in assigning probability weights to certain moral theories that's already under a degree of normative uncertainty. So how does that framework just doesn't seem to be able to bootstrap itself up to me?
Yeah, well, the probability, I mean, you might have different views about that. You might think that that's, to some extent, an orthogonal issue to morality and how to take that. So there's uncertainty in general that we have to deal with. Then it looks like there's this distinctive and especially theoretically difficult kind of uncertainty that comes from normative uncertainty, where whether you should try to maximize expected utility or always follow certain rules or act such in the way that a virtuous person would have acted, when the very decision criteria are in. So if one could somehow reduce that to normal uncertainty, then that would be progress, even if there remained interesting questions about normative uncertainty. I think that what does remain is if one picks a particular framework for resolving normative uncertainty, there is maybe then a high level of uncertainty as to which of these frameworks. So I could put forward this moral parliament model, somebody else could put forward a different model, and presumably we can't be sure which of these is correct, because it's a difficult philosophical cutting-edge question. And but it might well be still, though, that even if you just did this most simple-minded way at that level, even if you just picked the most probable framework for resolving moral uncertainty, that would already give you a more sophisticated and better justified approach than if you apply that arbitrary choice one level down, where you just pick the moral theory that you find better. You would at least enable more compromise and trade and satisfy a lot of other desiderata if you lifted it up one level, even if there remained some arbitrariness that was probably not quite optimal. And of course, you could imagine doing things like some kind of infinite hierarchy of having parliament deliberating about the rules of the other parliament, and then like some kind of multi-layer. I'm just not sure that you would gain very much more after you've taken the first step. So one might as well stop there for practical purposes, even though if you were actually probing this as like you were a philosophy student wanting to write your thesis on this, then certainly that's one of the kind of things you would want to maybe start to pull on.
Nick, you've got time for
one more question only? Well, did you ask before or not? I forget. Right, so let's keep waiting.
Thanks. Matthew Levy, Faculty of Physics. I had a question related to normative risk, or normative values rather. In your schematic, you showed the band of survivability and a down arrow to extinction, and then an up arrow to cosmic endowment. So I wondered if there's an absolute element associated with space, or if that's just a grammatical quirk. And I wonder if you could comment on multiplanetary life. You alluded to this before, and Elon Musk is interested in this too.
Yeah, I mean, so the diagram is just a schematic. So it's not meant to be drawn to scale or to any scale or to really represent anything specific about physical reality. I mean, what I do think about that is that, at least according to our current best understanding, there is this, I call it cosmic endowment, like basically some of the resources that could, in principle, be reached by civilization starting on our planet now, and then proceeding with mature technology to settle the rest of the universe. And I imagine that a mature civilization could do that at some significant fraction of the speed of light. I mean, whether it's 10% of the speed of light or 90%, it makes some difference to the numbers, like so the absolute level might be important, but in terms of the ramifications for what we should do today, it probably doesn't matter much whether the cosmic endowment is 10 to the power of 22 solar systems or 10 to the power of 20 solar systems. But some very, very large number like that. And that, assuming our current best models are correct, that would then be this fundamental limit at a finite distance from us, beyond which we couldn't reach. Because with the expansion of the universe, like intuitively, if we set out to reach a certain point, if that point is too far away, by the time we had reached halfway, space would have expanded enough that the remaining distance would be just as larger than the distance that separated the 2 points at the beginning. So there is a kind of horizon at some finite distance away from our planet, which defines the maximum size of the resources we could lay our paws on, in principle. But it's very, very large by any normal human standard. Now, I guess one should reserve some little probability that this physics understanding might be wrong, like some new kinds of physics phenomena that would make it possible to like wormhole into a different universe or create baby universes and stuff like that. You know, can't completely rule that out, given that cosmology is still in flux. Yeah, so that's, I think, all from me. Thank you all very much for turning up and for your questions.
Thank you, Nick. That was absolutely brilliant. Before you go, I just want to flag up some of our forthcoming events. If you haven't come to any of our other seminar series this term, please do have a look at our website. They're every Thursday at this time. Next week, we've got John Mühlbauer and Brian Nolan from INET looking at the question of inequality and its impacts. The week after, 12th of November, we have Professor Angela McLean talking about her work that we've funded in emerging infections and how to deal with pandemics. We also have a couple of big lectures coming up as well. Jos Delbecq, who is the Director General for Climate Action, will be giving a lecture on the 3rd of November, and there's still space available for that. And Lord Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, will be giving our 10th anniversary lecture on the 23rd of November. So do take a look at our website. But yes, please give Nick another round of applause for a great talk. See you soon. Oh, you need that.